Thanks everyone for joining. Excited to be here today to be presenting on some of our work that we do here at LBL around building performance standards, around better climate challenge, and the broader ecosystem of existing buildings and decarbonization associated with those buildings. Just to quickly introduce myself, Jack Case, I'm a technology researcher here at the lab. After this, I'll let Nora, my co-presenter, quickly introduce herself, and then we'll get into our slides. I actually spent most of my career working on the private sector side. So I'm a mechanical engineer by trade. I've done energy efficiency in existing buildings for virtually my whole career, doing energy audits, retro-commissioning studies, working with large portfolios of buildings on broader energy management and decarbonization plans. Joined the lab about a year and a half ago, and really have been helping to build a lot of the work that I've done on the building side into the policy support side of decarbonizing buildings across the country. So with that, I'll just really quickly turn it over to Nora to introduce herself.
Thanks, Josh. Hi, everyone. I am Nora Hart. I'm also a technology researcher at Berkeley Lab, and I also joined about a year and a half ago. And prior to Berkeley Lab, I worked in commercial real estate, helping clients with large portfolios meet their decarbonization goals, which once I speak about the Better Climate Challenge here in a little bit, you'll see there's a lot of overlap between what I was doing in the commercial world and what I'm now doing for the lab. So thanks, Josh. I'll let you take it away.
Thanks, Nora. Yeah, and it'll be interesting as we go through this to sort of talk through the interplay of the two big topics that we're covering here, and how Nora and my experience kind of overlaps with those components. So just to get into the agenda really quickly, we're going to do a quick primer on both building performance standards overall as a concept, get into an overview of the Better Climate Challenge, talk about how those two pieces fit together and some of the both challenges and opportunities that exist that have come to the fore because of policies and programs like this. And then we'll get a little bit more into the nuts and bolts of resources that are available, and how voluntary frameworks can sort of be used to drive one side of the market while building performance standards hold up the rear in the same vein. So in the interest of time, I'll get right into it here. Building performance standards are a relatively new concept, as in, probably over the past decade. There have been things prior to this decade around energy performance of existing buildings, but in a explicit policy that's really geared towards ongoing annual evaluation of the way that buildings operate, it is relatively novel, and it is a paradigm shift in the way that building performance is evaluated. So this is a move from what used to be a market geared around new code, new energy codes, and new construction being the priority of high performance buildings, into now the existing building stock, which is, as many of you know, just as critical as any new building, is making sure that the buildings that are already there are efficient and performing well. And there's a lot that comes along with that, right, in terms of the way that buildings are evaluated, how often they're evaluated, and some of the strategies that are used to drive compliance. And so BPS started in a few different regions across the US. It actually kind of correlated with the US taking a step out of the Paris Climate Agreement. As a country, when we made that decision, there was a lot of more grassroots efforts across the country to, at the city level, at the jurisdictional level, counties, and more and more with states, to meet those climate agreements. And even if we aren't doing it as a country, we're going to do it as a city, we're going to do it as a county, we're going to do it as a state. And so that led to a lot of the initial policies, but it also led to what is currently the Wild West of building performance standards. And so it's a really exciting market right now, but it is also a pretty volatile one in terms of what buildings are actually going to be able to do and how these policies are going to affect those buildings' performance. The general concept is that on a property type by property type basis, cities, counties, and states, I'm just going to refer to them as jurisdictions from now on, because it really can be at any of those levels, set specific performance targets based off of annual benchmarking data. So this could be energy use intensity, it could be GHG intensity of an asset, it could be on-site fuel consumption. There are a bunch of different flavors that I'll get into, but the common thread is that over a period of time, you have compliance cycles, so targets that are set that are increasingly rigorous over time. So you might have a target in, as we're showing in this visual, a target in 2024, and then a second compliance cycle forward looking into 2025. And each of those targets has different implications for each individual building. Most of the time, these targets are set at the property type level, but they are also sometimes set at individual buildings, depending on adjustments and things like that go into the overall administrative and compliance process associated with BPS. And so we are seeing a lot of these policies pop up across the country. And as I mentioned before, it is a relatively grassroots approach. Standardization has been coming, especially over the past 3 to 4 years. A lot of the work that we do here at LBL is to support standardization and transparency of these policies. But the growth is undeniable in terms of the number of either cities, counties, or states that have committed to BPS as something that they are looking to implement. We're typically talking about larger buildings when we talk about BPS. So most policies are either 25,000 square feet and larger or 50,000 square feet and larger. There are a few policies that are going smaller than that over time on more of an iterative basis. But right now, the cohort of buildings, and this was led by President Biden standing up what's called the National BPS Coalition, so a coalition of these jurisdictions that have essentially committed to implementing BPS in the coming years. And this current cohort represents 20% of the building square footage nationwide. And so, this is really in the early stages, as I was saying, but still already looking to affect a large population of the buildings across the US. There is also a federal BPS that was announced in December 2022. That applies specifically to federally owned buildings and has a couple different nuances associated with their approach, a little bit more focused on on-site fuel consumption, but it is also a huge step in the direction of ongoing performance evaluation of buildings. ACEEE is one of many organizations that have shown the overall savings potential associated with BPS implementation. So next couple of slides, I'm going to run through and just give you guys a flavor of some of the policies that are out there. Each row here represents one of the jurisdictions that has already or is looking to implement BPS policies across their region. Usually it is built around a emissions reduction goal as the starting point. So as I noted before, this may be a external commitment to the Paris Climate Agreement. This could be just a climate action plan that has been developed by a particular city or county. But usually those macro goals associated with emission reductions feed into the BPS policy and the specifics of the policy. There is always a implementation timeline that's associated with cohorts of buildings. So as I noted before, the targets typically get more aggressive over time. The coverage of buildings may also change over time. A lot of jurisdictions also apply more stringent coverage of state or county-owned assets. So you can see here, DC, even though they're only requiring buildings 50,000 square feet and larger on the private side in 2025, they are requiring municipal buildings greater than 10,000 square feet to also comply with the same standard. So we always like to see that from the standpoint of jurisdictions leading by example with performance of individual buildings. One of the other major differences between the different BPS policies that we see is the pathways to compliance themselves. So a big component of this are the metrics that are used. A lot of jurisdictions are using basic site energy use intensity as their overall efficiency metric for a building. A lot of policies are also using GHG intensity overall of an asset in terms of setting that target for compliance. And some are even now starting to use multiple targets to really make sure that they're pushing the type of interventions that they want to see at a building. I could speak to the state of Maryland has a policy that we've been working on with them built around direct GHG emissions. So this is a mandate around on-site fuel use with a provision associated with overall site EUI as a efficiency backstop to the policy. So what do I mean by that? A on-site fuel BPS is typically electrification focused, meaning by reducing the amount of fossil fuels you can consume on site, you're encouraging buildings to take a current, maybe natural gas fired system, propane fired system, and convert that over to an electrically driven system in whatever it may be, either space heating, domestic hot water, laundry, etc. There are ways to electrify buildings that are efficient and inefficient, and a dual metric approach essentially allows you to make sure that when people do electrify their building, they're doing so in a more efficient way, has less impact on the grid overall, and will lead to a higher performing building, both from a cost and from an environmental impact standpoint. And so you can see here all sorts of different flavors of policies. You have DC and New York City are two that have been, the rubber is finally hitting the road this year. So this is apt timing for this presentation, as in, the performance period started January 1 for a couple of these jurisdictions, and, the operations and utility bills associated with those buildings today are going to go into that evaluation of whether they hit their target or whether they exceed their target over time. So a lot of different policies and a lot of confusion potentially for individual building owners when it comes to complying with these policies. Another thing I'll note is some of these are geographically nested policies. You can see Montgomery County within Maryland has their own BPS. There is also a statewide BPS in Maryland. So theoretically, if you're a building in Montgomery County, you have two different BPS thresholds that are of concern to you. Typically, we work with jurisdictions, this is definitely the case with Maryland, to make sure that county targets and city level targets are just more aggressive and standardized with the state level targets to make things a bit easier. But there is still a lot of work that buildings need to do to make sure that they are in compliance. And so with that, I'll turn it over quickly to Nora to give a primer on the Better Climate Challenge.
Thanks, Josh. So we're shifting gears just a little bit. Josh was talking about building performance standards, which are required by jurisdictions for buildings in their areas to meet these certain goals for energy use or emissions. Now I'm taking a step back and I'm going to talk about the Better Climate Challenge, which is a voluntary program. Next slide. Organizations that commit to the Better Climate Challenge are joining this program that is run by the U.S. Department of Energy, and then Berkeley Lab, where I work, is providing technical assistance. So when an organization joins the Better Climate Challenge, they are voluntarily committing to reduce their portfolio-wide emissions, scope 1 and 2, by 50% within 10 years. So organizations in this challenge may have certain buildings that fall under a building performance standard, while they also have this large portfolio-wide target that they want to meet for their whole portfolio. Next slide. And just to kind of dig in and explain a little bit what we mean by a reduction in scope 1 and 2 emissions is, if you look in this graphic here, greenhouse gas emissions are all of those that are kind of up in that cloud there. You'll often hear it in terms of CO2 equivalent. So there's different types of greenhouse gas emissions, and CO2e is kind of the common way they're described. And when we talk about scope 1 emissions for a company, those are all the emissions that are actually controlled by the company and their facilities. So if you are burning natural gas on site, or if you have company vehicles that are burning gas, that is your scope 1 direct emissions. Scope 2 emissions are any purchased electricity, steam used for heating and cooling. So you have your vehicles and then your building portfolio that contribute to these scope 1 and 2. Scope 3 are indirect emissions, and they may be part of the value chain of an organization, but for the Better Climate Challenge, they're not going to be included. And so I just wanted to give you that definition because as Josh talks about building performance standards, there are some jurisdictions that are setting greenhouse gas emission standards for buildings. And with that, I'll pass off to Josh and I'll talk a little more about Better Climate Challenge later.
Yeah, thanks, Nora. And it's a great introduction. And so probably the question you are all have in the back of your head right now is, why are we talking about these two things together? And, the reason why these things are tied together is really related to the fact that they're both supporting whole market adoption of high performance buildings. They're doing it in different ways, obviously. Better Climate Challenge is a voluntary program. It's built around recognition. It's about forging new pathways for buildings at the cutting edge of either new technologies or new operational practices that drive decarbonization and that performance. Building performance standards, on the other hand, are a little bit more focused on the late adoption side of the market, right? So, and this isn't just buildings that are being less proactive. There are real, both financial, organizational, and technical reasons why buildings, especially existing buildings, operate inefficiently today, despite the best intentions of a particular building owner, property manager, et cetera, et cetera. And so we like to see these concepts sort of work in concert to help drive the market overall, based around the concept that you have new pathways and you have carrots and sticks associated with driving annual energy performance of buildings. The other thing that really almost more important than anything else that ties these two things together is the empirical nature of the way that Better Climate Challenge and building performance standards operate. What do I mean by empirical? Your actual utility bills are going into whether you comply or not. This is in comparison to, again, new construction codes where you may be able to design a building that operates efficiently, check prescriptive boxes in terms of either an energy model or design elements of a particular building and be in compliance. This is instead looking at the retrospective of how the building actually performed and evaluating you based off of that. And so because of that, design is only one of the dimensions you really need to be concerned about when you're looking at overall building compliance. The other major component here is operations. You could have an extremely well-designed building. I can definitely say, as a former energy auditor in New York City, I have done audits of LEED, platinum, designed buildings with incredibly advanced control systems that are operated very poorly and are now really looking at big annual fines associated with their poor performance. And so this chart is really here to show the fact that design and operations really need to work in concert if you're going to drive a high performance building. Just to put a little bit more of a point on this in terms of the dimensions that I'm showing here, design could be anywhere from a net zero energy passive house design down to aging systems with a leaky envelope and pneumatic controls. You could have the best operator in the world. If they're looking at that overall infrastructure at their building, they're probably going to struggle to comply with the BPS and or be delineated as a high performance building. And so operations, again, and design need to come together to drive annual performance and ongoing performance of individual assets. So beyond those, the concept there of operations and design, there are a lot of different barriers that exist in our market that prevent both of these dimensions from being realized. And so over time, Better Climate Challenge and the BPS team have worked together and sort of established really good comprehensive lists of different barriers that exist, bucketed by, you can see here we're showing technical barriers. So that's obviously going to focus within the world of building performance for many, many years. You need equipment that is efficient. You need building envelopes that are extremely effective. Things like energy recovery, existing infrastructure being able to be converted into a new infrastructure based off of either a fuel type you need to use or overall performance you're trying to achieve. Technical barriers is one of those big buckets, but it is only one of the buckets. Market is just as important when it comes to making sure that there's a associated financial interest in upgrading your building. Again, this market is tackled both by BPS and BCC in different ways. And then organizational practices. So you could have energy efficiency projects on deck that make a lot of sense. You may not have the organizational structure to be able to make a strong decision on that. You know, it's either not being prioritized or it's an unknown, right? A lot of organizations don't necessarily have the expertise to be able to say XYZ opportunities exist in my building for implementation. And it's hard to invest in something if you don't necessarily know the savings associated with it. So I'm going to go through each of these buckets in a little bit more detail and how some of the resources work together to support. Technical Better Climate Challenge has been doing this for many years now, and they have a really impressive approach that's associated with technical assistance. So they deliver direct technical assistance to organizations that are part of Better Climate Challenge. These are in the weeds questions associated with systems at individual buildings or across a portfolio, implementation practices, et cetera. Every time they have one of those engagements, they are not just helping that entity, they're also building knowledge bases and other resources that then can be used by others that are facing the same sort of issues. Market-based barriers. BPS is actually a big, as I was showing in the slide earlier around the market, BPS represents really the biggest and only stick that exists on ongoing existing building performance. And that creates a financial signal within the market. So if I have a building that's facing fines because of a BPS requirement in 2024, my savings calculations associated with a particular retrofit or with a particular operational practice will be supported by the fact that you would be avoiding a fine by implementing that recommendation or that practice. So you have BPS that's helping to drive sort of that back end of the market. And then, you know, also from the standpoint of Better Climate Challenge, they are working with organizations as a starting point, right? So these are portfolio level targets that are set for real estate entities, school districts, et cetera, that are looking to implement and support a certain target. And because of that, they have a lot of amazing resources really built around this concept of I have a portfolio of buildings. I am an organization that needs to implement high performance buildings. Where do I start? How do I go from there? How do I build a framework and structure that allows me to be smart about the way that I decarbonize my portfolio? In that same way, building performance standards also support organizational practices overall at individual entities, and we actually work together on this as well. So we have worked with jurisdictions that have asked us very specific questions around, let's say, you know, it's a particularly cold climate in a given city, and they have a lot of boiler buildings that are fed by natural gas. They have green electricity. They want a policy that's going to electrify those boiler systems. Not necessarily an easy thing to do, in particular in colder climates. And so we were, you know, able to work on the BPS team, work directly with Better Climate Challenge to provide resources to that jurisdiction based off of past work that they've done around electrification, past work that they've seen around electrification success stories in those types of boiler buildings. So we try to work together as we can to drive a lot of this overall work. With that, I'm going to hand it back to Nora here to talk through our resources in a bit more broad way.
Thanks all. And we are a little bit over time, so I'm actually going to ask Josh to skip 2 slides ahead.
You got it. Apologies for that.
No problem. And we'll just pause here and close out. So with everything Josh said, the lab and Department of Energy are trying to make resources to overcome some of these barriers. So if you use this QR code here, you can see one of our most recent resources that came out of Better Climate Challenge. And we can also use that for organizations trying to meet building performance standards. So thank you everybody for joining today. It looks like we have just a couple of minutes left for Q&A since we're going into a break.
Thank you, Josh and Nora. This was fantastic. We have one question here, which is about the sort of how well documented and disseminated are the standards and the strategies, so they can sort of cities and other entities can kind of build on what's been done.
Yeah, so it's a good question, and one that probably over the past 24 months, we've seen a lot of progress on this front when it comes to both landscape review of existing BPS policies and then also technical resources around how to go about implementing BPS. So I'll just call to this a couple of key resources. ACEEE has released a landscape study at, I think it was the second quarter of 2023, around BPS policies across the world, with a real focus on the US BPS policies, the differences and similarities within them. So that's more academic from the standpoint of being able to look at the overall landscape and the specific nuances of each policy. And then ASHRAE has also released a guide that we amongst the other national labs were part of around technical implementation of BPS frameworks. So how you go about baselining your assets, setting targets, and producing a compliance framework that fits the overall goals of what you're trying to do. So we can definitely feel free to follow up with us. I'll skip really quickly here to our email slide. Apologies again for going over on my time here, but please reach out and we can definitely provide more detailed resources on any questions that may come up.
Thank you. Somebody is asking if they can email you about emerging technologies in Chicago. I would say yes. Okay, that was answered. Maybe the last one, bringing this back to education for technical folks here. How much do you think this should be taught, and kind of the students should be made aware of in sort of technical colleges or on community colleges, as opposed to just like learning it in real life and business?
Sure. I can give a quick answer here, Nora. You can also feel free to chime in. From a BPS standpoint, we see this as a huge market driver of activity within buildings. So everything from energy auditing professionals, commissioning professionals, sustainability consultants, Nora and myself in our previous careers, we're doing this type of work. There's a huge increase that we're going to see in people who have this expertise associated with individual building performance over time. I think also on the retrofit side, you have contractors, MEPs, and others that are actually doing the work to get things implemented, and then engineers at those buildings that are driving the operational performance over the course of the year for a given target. So huge increases in those market opportunities that exist. And so I definitely recommend technical schools and the associated students to really be keeping this top of mind as they're looking to build out their own skill sets.
Yeah, and just to add a little bit to what Josh said, I think along with the drivers from building performance standards, there are also organizations voluntarily committing to reduce their emissions. And that leads to a change in technology that companies want to implement in their building. And so as a student or as a professor, it's important to stay abreast of these changes so you can understand, what's happening with electrification, how does that change HVAC design, operations, and maintenance. So all these technologies needed to meet these goals, it's really important that people new coming into the industry understand these technologies, because this demand is increasing and it's a new demand that maybe it wasn't there before.